The wind, a relentless tormentor, scoured the plains of endurance, carrying with it the grit of 1,000 barren miles and the scent of despair. It whipped Ilara's thin shawl about her face, a flimsy defense against the vast, indifferent sky and the even colder stares of the few souls who bothered to notice her arrival. The train, a monstrous iron beast, had disgorged her onto the splintered platform like an unwanted piece of cargo, its mournful whistle fading into the immensity of the landscape, leaving behind a silence that amplified the frantic thumping of her heart. In her worn gloved hands, she clutched a small, battered valise and the creased letter from Mr. Alastair Finch, its promises of a new life now feeling as brittle as dried leaves. Endurance. The name itself was a cruel jest, for all strength felt leached from her, replaced by a gnawing nausea that was more than just travel sickness. Each gust of wind seemed to whisper accusations, each shadow seemed to lengthen with judgment. This was the precipice of her hope, and already, the abyss yawned. Mr. Finch awaited her by the ramshackle station house, a man etched by the same harsh elements that defined the town. He was older than his carefully penned letters suggested, his eyes, small and sharp, raking over her with an unnerving intensity that bypassed polite assessment and landed squarely on appraisal, like a rancher inspecting livestock. Beside him stood a woman, gaunt and severe, whose gaze missed nothing, least of all the subtle, almost imperceptible swell beneath Ilara's carefully arranged dress, a secret Ilara had prayed would remain hers a little longer. But prayers, she was learning, rarely traversed these empty plains. The woman murmured something to Finch, a sibilant whisper that carried the venom of a snake. Finch's face, already stern, hardened into a mask of cold fury. "You come to me, deceitful." His voice, though not loud, cracked through the thin veneer of Ilara's composure. The accusation, unspoken but universally understood, hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "With child." The words were a brand, searing into her. He gestured to her valise, a sharp, dismissive flick of his wrist. "I'll not be saddled with another man's shame." The pronouncements echoed down the dusty, forsaken street. Doors that had been slightly ajar seemed to click shut. Faces that had been curious now turned away, etched with scorn or a righteous satisfaction. Ilara stood alone, the valise at her feet, a monument to her shattered dreams. The world, which had once held the desperate promise of escape, now shrunk to this single, brutal point of public humiliation and utter abandonment. From the shadowed doorway of the smithy across the street, a pair of eyes watched, steady and unreadable. She registered them only fleetingly, a flicker in her periphery, as the full weight of her desolation threatened to pull her under the swirling dust. The sun beat down, merciless, reflecting the arid landscape of her future. Endurance offered no solace, only a stark panorama of her failure. Return was an impossibility, a phantom option for which she possessed neither coin nor courage. The condemnation of Mr. Finch had been swift and absolute, a decree that resonated through the shuttered windows and closed doors of the fledgling township. She approached the general store, its porch sagging like a weary sigh, hoping for a moment's respite, perhaps a sympathetic ear, or even the smallest chance of work. The proprietor, a man whose face seemed permanently puckered from tasting bitter truths, listened with a veneer of politeness, his eyes, however, darting to her stomach, then away, as if the sight were an affront. "No help needed here, miss," he'd stated, his tone final, the unspoken addendum clear, *no help for your kind star. The small, whitewashed church at the edge of what could generously be called a street offered even less. Its door was locked, its windows dark, as if God himself had turned his back. The wind, her constant companion, whispered insidious suggestions of surrender, of simply lying down in the dust and letting the vast, uncaring sky swallow her whole. But then, a small, insistent flutter deep within her, a tiny life clinging to its own precarious existence, anchored her to the brutal present. It was for this unseen child that she had to endure, to find some sliver of hope in this wasteland of judgment. Her aimless wandering, born of desperation, eventually led her back towards the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil, a sound that had been a distant, almost unnoticed counterpoint to Finch's earlier pronouncements. The smithy. The man from its shadowed doorway, the silent observer of her disgrace, was there, his back to the street, muscles coiling and uncoiling under a sweat-stained shirt as he shaped raw iron into purpose. He must have sensed her presence, for the hammering paused. He turned, slowly, his face smudged with soot, his expression unreadable. He said nothing, merely looked at her, a long, considering gaze that held neither the open hostility of Finch nor the veiled disgust of the storekeeper. It was nothing. And in that nothingness, a tiny, irrational seed of something other than terror began to germinate. He gestured with his head towards a water barrel by the trough, a dipper hanging from its side. A silent invitation, or perhaps just an acknowledgement of a basic human need. Ilara hesitated, pride warring with a thirst that cracked her lips. The dread of further humiliation was a physical weight, yet his silence, his sheer lack of overt reaction, was a strange sort of reprieve. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the immense horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows, she saw him from a distance, leaving the smithy. He paused near a dilapidated lean-to attached to the main structure, a place seemingly used for storing old tack and broken wagon wheels. He placed something on an overturned crate just inside its shadowed entrance, a bundled cloth, before walking towards a small, solitary cabin further down the track. He did not look back. The lean-to offered little more than a partial shield from the relentless wind and the prying eyes of endurance, but it was marginally better than the open street. Ilara, driven by a primal need for shelter as the temperature plummeted with the setting sun, crept towards it. The bundled cloth contained a hunk of dark bread and a piece of dried meat. Coarse fare, but to her, a feast. She ate slowly, huddled in the deepest shadow, the taste of dust mingling with the unexpected charity. The smith, Silas, she learned his name was, from a brief, grudging exchange she overheard between him and a disgruntled farmer haggling over the price of horseshoes. He lived as he worked, alone, with a quiet intensity that kept the townsfolk at a respectful distance. They needed his skill with forge and hammer, but he was not one of them, not in the way they gathered for meager socials or whispered judgments in the general store. He was an island, his silence a formidable boundary. Days bled into one another, each marked by the rising sun and the rhythmic song of Silas's hammer. He never approached her directly in her makeshift sanctuary. Food, and occasionally a pail of fresh water, would appear near the lean-to, usually when he departed for his cabin in the evening or before he began his work at dawn. He moved with an economy of motion, his presence large yet unobtrusive. From her shadowed corner, Ilara watched him. She saw the meticulous care he took with his tools, the raw strength as he wrestled with iron and recalcitrant horses, the rare, almost imperceptible softening of his gaze when a child, braver than its parents, might wander near the smithy, drawn by the fire and noise. He never spoke to the child, but he wouldn't chase it away either. Shame was a constant companion, a hot flush that rose whenever she considered her reliance on this silent stranger. Gratitude was a more complex emotion, tangled with fear and uncertainty. What did he want? What could she possibly offer in return? The life within her grew, a more pronounced curve to her belly, a constant reminder of her vulnerability and, increasingly, her fierce, primal determination. She began to sweep the dirt floor of the lean-to with a broken piece of board, arranging the few discarded items into a semblance of order. It was a small act of defiance against the chaos of her circumstances, a claiming of this tiny, borrowed space. He would have noticed. He noticed everything. But still, he said nothing. The silence stretched, taut and resonant, a language all its own. The sky, which had been a brassy, unrelenting blue for weeks, turned a bruised purple one afternoon. The wind, usually a dry, scouring force, picked up a sudden, damp chill, carrying the metallic scent of imminent rain. Within an hour, the heavens opened, not with a gentle shower, but with a furious deluge that turned the dust of endurance into a slick, impassable mire. The lean-to, her fragile sanctuary, was no match for the storm's ferocity. Rainwater found every crack and flaw in the old timbers, cascading in icy rivulets, pooling around her feet. The thin blanket Silas had silently left for her days ago was quickly soaked, offering little comfort against the bone-chilling damp. Ilara huddled, shivering, trying to shield her belly from the worst of the onslaught, a profound sense of hopelessness washing over her with each fresh gust that threatened to tear the structure apart. Through the sheeting rain, she saw a figure moving from the cabin towards the smithy. Silas. He was battling the wind, his shape indistinct in the downpour. He reached the main building, then, after a moment, emerged again, heading not back to his cabin, but towards her lean-to. He carried nothing, just himself against the storm. He didn't try the flimsy door, which was now swollen and jammed, but went to the weakest point in the wall, a section of rotting planks, and with a grunt of effort, tore them away, creating a ragged opening. He peered in, his face dripping, his expression grim. "Come," he said, his voice barely audible above the roar of the storm. It was the first direct command he had given her. There was no room for hesitation. Ilara, clutching her sodden blanket, scrambled through the opening. He didn't offer a hand, but waited, his presence a solid bulwark against the wind. He led her not into the main area of the smithy, with its open forge and scattered tools, but to a small, windowless storeroom at the back, usually filled with sacks of coal and iron bars. He had cleared a space, laying down several empty grain sacks to form a dry pallet. "Safer here," he stated, then turned and left, a dark shape swallowed by the storm once more as he presumably returned to check on his cabin. The rain hammered on the smithy roof, a deafening drum, but inside this small, dark space, it was dry. The immediate threat had passed, replaced by a different kind of tension, a subtle shift in the unspoken contract between them. Later, when the storm had exhausted its fury and rumbled away into the distance, leaving behind a washed, glistening world, he reappeared with a tin mug of something hot, weak, bitter coffee, but it warmed her hands and her core. He set it down, his gaze briefly meeting hers before flicking away. "Roof held," he said, more to himself than to her, then departed, leaving her to the quiet and the lingering scent of damp earth and coal dust. His provision for her, though still unspoken, felt different now. A little more direct, a little less like leaving scraps for a stray. The relentless progression of her pregnancy soon became a truth too obvious for even the most willfully blind citizens of endurance to ignore. The whispers that had followed Ilara like shadows now grew louder, more pointed, laced with a venomous self-righteousness. Mrs. Henderson, the storekeeper's wife, whose own piety was a subject of much local debate, would make a conspicuous sign of the cross whenever Ilara dared to venture out for water. Children, emboldened by their parents' disdain, sometimes threw pebbles, their childish taunts echoing the adult condemnations. "Shame! Shame!" Mr. Finch, encountering her once near the well, had curled his lip in a sneer of such profound disgust that Ilara felt it like a physical blow. "Still polluting our town, I see," he declared, loud enough for several onlookers to hear and nod in sanctimonious agreement. Each insult was a fresh stab, yet with each one, a strange, unfamiliar resilience began to take root within Ilara. It was the fierce, primal instinct of a mother protecting her young, a tiny, flickering ember of defiance fanned by the constant assaults. She would not break. She could not. Silas, true to his taciturn nature, never spoke of the town's escalating hostility, nor of her increasingly visible condition. Yet, his protection, once passive, became subtly more active. If a knot of gossiping women gathered too close to the smithy when Ilara was fetching water from the barrel he kept filled for her, he would emerge, perhaps to clang a piece of metal with unnecessary force, or simply to stand, arms crossed, his silent, formidable presence enough to scatter them like startled crows. Once, two loutish drifters, new to town and emboldened by cheap whiskey, began to harass her with lewd suggestions as she walked back to the lean-to. Before Ilara could even fully register the threat, Silas was there, materializing from the smithy's shadow like a spectre of retribution. He said not a word. He simply took a step towards them, his eyes like chips of granite. The drifters, suddenly sobered by the sheer, potent menace radiating from him, mumbled apologies and stumbled away. Ilara stood trembling, a mixture of terror and a burgeoning, unfamiliar sense of security washing over her. He had intervened, directly, unequivocally. He glanced at her, a quick, almost imperceptible nod, before turning back to his forge. The silent understanding between them deepened. She began to take more care with the lean-to, patching small holes with scraps of canvas she found, even managing to coax a few resilient wildflowers, transplanted from the edge of the prairie, to grow in a rusty, discarded bucket near the entrance. It was a small, defiant gesture of homemaking, a quiet assertion of her right to exist, to nurture life in this barren, judgmental land. The first true pangs of labor came with the dawn, sharp and insistent, stealing her breath. Ilara pressed her hand to her swollen belly, a wave of panic and fierce determination washing over her. The child was coming. Here, in this dusty, windswept town that had offered her nothing but scorn, with only the silent, enigmatic Smith as a reluctant guardian. The Linta, her small haven, suddenly felt terrifyingly inadequate. How could she bring a child into the world in such a place? Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. Silas found her not long after, his usual morning routine interrupted by the sight of her, pale and drenched, leaning against the rough wall of the Linta. He stopped, his gaze taking in her distress, the subtle shift in her posture that spoke of more than just discomfort. He didn't ask. He seemed to simply know. For a long moment, he stood there, the early morning sun casting his long shadow towards her. The sounds of the waking town, a distant rooster, the creak of a wagon, faded into a tense silence, broken only by Ilara's ragged breathing. Then he spoke, his voice low, a rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. "Child needs a name," he said, not looking at her directly, but at some point just beyond her shoulder. "A roof." He paused, then added, his gaze finally meeting hers, stark and unyielding, "My name offers some cover. Town won't let you be, not like this." The proposition hung in the air, raw and unadorned. It was not a declaration of love, nor even affection. It was a statement of stark practicality, a lifeline offered in the face of an untenable reality. Ilara stared at him, her mind reeling. Marry him? This man of shadows and silence, this outcast who had offered her a sliver of kindness when the rest of the world had shown only cruelty? The implications were vast, terrifying. To bind herself to him, to accept his name for her child, a child that was not his. Why? The word was a whisper, torn from her, laden with a lifetime of hurt and a desperate need to understand. Silas looked away, towards the vast, empty prairie that stretched to the horizon. His profile was stark against the pale sky. "Seen enough hardship," he said, his voice rough. "Child deserves a chance." He turned back, his eyes holding hers, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths, loneliness, perhaps, or a quiet, deeply buried compassion. "It's the right thing." The simplicity of it, the stark, unvarnished honesty, disarmed her. There were no pretty words, no false promises. Just a man, offering what little he had, his name, his protection. Ilara thought of the child within her, the innocent life entirely dependent on her. She thought of the endless, barren road that stretched before her if she refused. Taking a shaky breath, she met his gaze. "Yes," she said, the word small but firm. "Yes." A leap of faith into an unknown future, guided only by the quiet strength of a man who spoke in deeds rather than words. There was no white dress, no joyful gathering, no solemn vows exchanged before a benevolent preacher. Their marriage was as stark and unceremonious as the landscape that surrounded Endurance. Silas simply informed the astonished, disapproving storekeeper, Mr. Henderson, that Ilara was now under his roof, and that her child would bear his name. The news rippled through the small community like a tremor, eliciting shocked whispers and renewed condemnation, but Silas's reputation as a man not to be trifled with, coupled with the town's grudging respect for his essential skills, kept the overt hostility at bay. He had claimed her, and by extension, her unborn child. The Linta was abandoned. Ilara moved into Silas's small, two-room cabin. It was sparsely furnished, utilitarian, yet possessed a cleanliness and order that spoke of its owner's meticulous nature. A sturdy bed, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs, a stone fireplace that dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean. It was a home, a sanctuary, however unconventional. Ilara, slow and heavy with the final stages of her pregnancy, began to add small touches, a jar of wildflowers on the table, her meager belongings neatly stowed, the faint scent of the soap she used to wash their few linens. Silas watched these small domestications with his usual silence, but there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a softening of the cabin's austere edges. The birth came 3 weeks later, on a night when a wild storm, much like the one that had driven her from the Linta, raged outside, rattling the shutters and howling like a banshee. The labor was long and arduous. Ilara, caught in a vortex of pain and exhaustion, felt her resolve waver. But Silas was there. He had fetched Martha, a reclusive woman who lived on the outskirts of town, rumored to possess knowledge of herbs and midwifery, herself an outcast tolerated for her skills. Between Martha's surprisingly gentle competence and Silas's steadfast, grounding presence, mopping Ilara's brow with a cool cloth, his large hand gripping hers during the worst of the contractions, his quiet words of encouragement, "Breathe, Ilara. You're strong," she found the strength to endure. With a final, wrenching cry, the baby was born as the storm outside began to subside, a small, perfect daughter with a fuzz of dark hair. Martha cleaned the infant and laid her in Ilara's waiting arms. A wave of profound, overwhelming love washed over Ilara, so potent it brought tears to her eyes. Silas, who had stood back during the final moments, moved closer. He looked down at the tiny, swaddled bundle, his usually guarded expression unreadable. Then, a flicker of something, wonder? Tenderness? Softened the harsh lines around his eyes. He gently touched the baby's cheek with a calloused finger. "A daughter," Ilara whispered, her voice hoarse. Silas nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "She'll need a good name." He paused. "Sarah. Sarah works. Sarah. A strong, simple name. Sarah, daughter of Ilara, now to be known as Sarah, daughter of Silas. The child had his name, a shield against the world. The fragile piece of their unconventional family was not destined to last unchallenged. Alastair Finch, his pride still smarting from Ilara's perceived deceit and perhaps from the town's grudging acceptance of Silas's bold claim, could not let the matter rest. He saw their quiet domesticity as an affront, a blatant disregard for the moral fabric he believed himself to uphold. He gathered a small contingent of like-minded townsmen, including the sanctimonious Mr. Henderson and a few others whose righteousness was easily inflamed. They appeared at Silas's cabin one late afternoon, their shadows long and menacing in the setting sun. Finch, his face a mask of cold fury, banged on the door. Silas opened it, his large frame filling the doorway, little Sarah asleep in a makeshift cradle just visible behind him. "Silas," Finch began, his voice dripping with contempt. "This farce has gone on long enough. That woman is a harlot, and that child is no more yours than it is mine. You disgrace yourself and this town by harboring them." Henderson chimed in, "It ain't right, Silas. It just ain't decent." Silas listened, his expression unchanging, his silence more intimidating than any shouted rebuttal. When they had finished their tirade, he spoke, his voice low and steady, yet carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of iron. "Ilara is my wife," he stated, each word deliberate. "Sarah is my daughter. This is my home." He took a step forward, subtly shifting his weight, a silent promise of action. "Leave." Finch, emboldened by his companions, sneered. "We ain't leaving until that whore and her bastard are gone from Endurance." Just then, Ilara appeared behind Silas, Sarah now awake and cradled protectively in her arms. The terrified, abandoned girl who had arrived in Endurance months ago was gone. In her place stood a woman, her eyes clear and direct, her stance defiant. Motherhood, and the quiet, unwavering support of the man beside her, had forged an unexpected strength within her. "We have done no one any harm," she said, her voice surprisingly firm, cutting through the tension. "Mr. Finch, your judgment was delivered long ago. We ask only to be left in peace, to raise our child." Her gaze did not waver from Finch's. The directness of her address, her quiet dignity, seemed to momentarily stun the men. Finch spluttered, "She speaks! The audacity!" But his bluster seemed diminished. Silas remained a bulwark of silent threat, and Ilara, no longer a cowering victim but a woman defending her family, presented a united front that was more formidable than they had anticipated. The confrontation hung in the balance, a spark away from violence. But the unshakable resolve in Silas's eyes, and the unexpected resilience in Ilara's, gave them pause. Grumbling, muttering about godlessness and the decline of decency, Finch and his men eventually backed away, their threats dwindling into the dusty twilight. They had come expecting to break a solitary, stubborn man and a fallen woman. They had found a fortress, small but unbreachable. The dust settled in the wake of their departure, leaving behind a quiet that hummed with unspoken emotions. Silas closed the cabin door, the simple act a definitive statement against the retreating tide of malice. He turned to Ilara, who still held Sarah close, her heart thudding a steady rhythm against the baby's warmth. Their eyes met, a long, searching look that transcended the need for words. In that shared gaze lay an acknowledgement of the battle fought and won, a testament to the unexpected strength they had found in each other. A small, almost imperceptible nod passed between them, a confirmation of their alliance, their partnership forged in the crucible of societal scorn and shared survival. Ilara felt a profound shift within her. The shame that had clung to her like a shroud for so long had finally begun to dissipate, replaced by a quiet sense of worth, of dignity reclaimed not by defiance alone, but by the acceptance and protection offered by this stoic, unconventional man. He had not sought to erase her past, but had stood with her in her present, offering his name as a shield and his strength as a foundation. She was no longer just Ilara, the rejected mail-order bride, the woman whispered about in hushed, condemnatory tones. She was Ilara, mother to Sarah, wife to Silas, role she now inhabited with a burgeoning confidence. For Silas, too, something had irrevocably changed. The solitary existence he had carved out for himself in endurance had been breached, not by force, but by the quiet persistence of need and the unexpected blossoming of connection. The cabin, once merely a shelter, now held the warmth of family, the soft sounds of a baby's breath, the subtle presence of a woman who had weathered her own storms and emerged, not unscathed, but undeniably whole. The future remained an unwritten page, the prairie wind still whispered of hardship, and the judgment of endurance would likely linger in the shadows. But as the last light of day faded, casting a warm glow through the small cabin window, a sense of resilient hope settled over them. Silas stoked the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Ilara gently placed Sarah in her cradle, a soft lullaby humming on her lips. They had faced the worst of their world and had not broken. They had found solace not in acceptance from others, but within the small, fiercely protected circle of their own making. The wind might howl, but within these walls, there was warmth, there was strength, there was the quiet promise of a shared tomorrow.